Hi, everyone. My name is Simon Wong. I'm a security specialist here at CDW, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mitch and our presentation today. Thanks for joining. So you've joined Why Vulnerability Management Matters, and this is a fourth in a series for those of you who have attended the other sessions. And this one's a very practical session. This is going to be a lot of the gotchas. You know, what have we seen our clients experience implementing vulnerability management programs, the good and the bad, and how to avoid the bad. We've received some excellent questions from a lot of registered attendees, and so about half of them are going to be answered by Mitch during the course of the presentation, and the other half we're going to tackle at the very end. We'll go through each question one by one and make sure they get answered. Feel free to use the Q&A. So there's a Q&A function here in WebEx. You can submit questions. We'll compile those and we'll make sure those get answered at the end as well. All right. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Mitch Kelsey. He's our cybersecurity advisor at CDW and has been working in cybersecurity for a long time. He's our resident Tenable guardian as well. And we'll talk a little bit about Tenable technology in this, but also on the broader topic of vulnerability management programs. Over to you, Mitch. For doing this.
Thanks, Simon. I also want to take a moment here right at the beginning of the presentation to thank Tenable for the partnership, not only for this episode, but for the series in general. They're a great partner for us in this space, and looking forward to being able to speak further about how we can put some of the concepts that we've talked about into practice. So as Simon mentioned, I'm a cybersecurity advisor here with CDW, and so in my day-to-day job, my primary responsibility is helping organizations with their cybersecurity program development. So vulnerability management is certainly an important part of this, and one of the things that we want to touch on today is how to best integrate that technological conversation into a broader security context to be able to elevate that conversation to your business leaders and help you to be able to describe, you know, the ongoing operational risks that your team are facing and how they're going to play into larger business conversations. As Simon mentioned, he's one of our security subject matter experts here at CDW. I'm also going to be reaching out at different stages in this webinar to get his thoughts on some of the ways that our customers have tackled some of these issues for good and for bad, and be able to share some of those experiences with you as well. So just to recap, from the previous episodes, we tried to break down conceptually a couple of different areas of challenges and understanding about vulnerability management, starting right from the beginning about what vulnerabilities are in your environment and why they matter. And the reason why we're revisiting this topic today is being able to help you work with your business leadership, your non-security experts within the organization to be able to define risk and help understand your organization's risk appetite for the recommendations that you're making. We also touched on what vulnerabilities look like in some of the newer domains that security teams are facing. So places like in your DevOps environment, in your software development lifecycle, as well as some other spaces like organizations who are increasingly having to deal with IoT and operational technology challenges, and some of the different ways that vulnerabilities appear there and how we have to address them differently. So here we also want to identify, you know, where vulnerability management sits within your organization and how we can address remediation in those spaces, but also what those integration opportunities may look like to be able to leverage vulnerability management intelligence. And then finally, you know, where are the opportunities that we can help systematize this as an organization and help elevate that conversation to be able to better leverage vulnerability management to improve your security practice and some of the other related services your organization is responsible for overall. If you do want to revisit those conversations in depth, we've posted the first couple episodes on our YouTube channel. So each one of them are going to cover the topics from a slightly different perspective, and all three are available there as well. And this fourth episode will be uploaded there shortly too. just to get into the agenda of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start from the beginning of how to put those concepts into practice. So we're going to cover a couple different areas of focus related to that, and then we're going to focus on summarizing what we've covered over this series, as well as identify some additional resources, both from what CDW is able to provide and also some really great resources that the Tenable team has as well. And then talk a little bit more about the Tenable platform more generally, and then also some next steps to consider, and then answer any questions that have arisen. Let's talk about vulnerability management's dirty little secret. What makes vulnerability management so influential is its alignment with business risk. When that goes really poorly, you get what happened with Equifax, and we broke down that unfortunate, exploitation of that vulnerability in the first episode. So if you want to learn that in more detail, please revisit that before. But effectively, if you're going to break down the fundamental problem with what happened to Equifax, it was a misalignment of priorities between the teams that actually had to perform remediation on vulnerabilities and that visibility that the entire security team needed to have. In fact, there was a notice that went out in that case, but it just wasn't received appropriately because that prioritization of risk didn't happen at the right time. And when it goes well, you can significantly reduce your organization's attack success rate. So that's actually a topic that we covered in CDW Canada's 2020 security study, and we're going to cover that in a little more detail in a minute. So how do you start to think about that alignment? There's a couple questions that you need to be able to answer to be able to address this. First of all, it's getting the idea of what your organization's risk tolerance looks like. And that's going to be different not only between organizations, but it's also going to be different for different aspects of your business operations. And being cognizant of that as security professionals is really important to be able to understand how best to prioritize the recommendations that you have, but also the way that you describe it to those non-security folks within your organization to best get buy-in from them. It's also important to keep in mind who owns remediation with those different types of assets. So we talked about your typical endpoint and server infrastructure in previous episodes, and also some of those newer domains that security teams are having to secure on top of those existing pieces. And remediation is going to look different depending on the services that you're responsible for, and also who within the organization owns those different pieces. And then how do you prioritize? If you're looking at that, that long list of vulnerabilities that you see, where do you start, and what are things that you can focus on, or what are things that you can save for later potentially? And I think it's fair to say that none of these questions are technology specific. They're all political questions, and being able to understand as security professionals how to influence that conversation to best get the support of those non-security people in the organization who are ultimately going to be responsible for addressing the concerns that are identified is something that we need to consider to be effective. So Simon, what do you think is the biggest political challenge that organizations who are new to doing vulnerability management need to address early on?
I would say I don't know if it's the biggest, but certainly the most common political challenge is just relevance, kind of the output of vulnerability management activities. There's a tendency to start with a systems view. So you're approaching vulnerability management almost as, you're taking the CIS top 20 approach of inventorying assets and contextual data around vulnerabilities on those assets. And so you end up with a lot of information, but none of it's directly relevant to specific stakeholders within your organization. So you think early on, one of the easiest things to address this with is to identify leaders within your organization. It doesn't have to be C-level. These could be application owners or systems owners that have a significant stake and kind of work backwards from their exposure so that vulnerabilities can be presented in a way that's relevant. Otherwise, it's often cast aside as a siloed practice and ignored as noise. would be my thoughts on that.
I certainly agree there. So when we're talking about risk tolerance, it's important to understand that this doesn't just cover which vulnerabilities we address and which we aren't, and in which order. We also need to understand the perceived risk of scanning in the first place. Especially if you're new to this type of activity in an organization, people in IT operations, have heard horror stories in the past about vulnerability management going wrong. So your team knocking over a web server or a fragile system during a scan, or noticeable degradation of network performance because there was just a misalignment of expectations and understanding where those focal areas need to be. And I think Simon's approach of having the conversation with those asset owners and those who are going to be responsible for addressing this on one side, but also who may be impacted by this within the organization. It's important to keep that in mind and ensure that you are able to speak to those challenges as you start this practice. Translating cybersecurity risk into business risk. As we've discussed, many of the stakeholders that we support may not understand these security risks the same way that we do. And how can we help demonstrate these risks in a way that is helpful to them and leads to the decision making that's going to better improve our organizational security posture? And this was actually one of the questions that was presented previously, was when speaking to people in leadership, how do you avoid that that terror conversation about they've read something in the news that sounds apocalyptic from a security vulnerability perspective. How can we properly address this in a way that they understand the context here in terms of it's meaningful to our organization, and do it in a way that's going to be proactive? That's on one hand of things. And on the other hand, it may be the fact that you have to demonstrate that a vulnerability actually is a serious risk to the organization. And in both cases, the best way that we can do this is to be cognizant of the approach that those stakeholders have, depending on who they are. And so they may be your operational leadership who are responsible for ensuring availability of your services, or exhaustion of resource prevention. They may be concerned with third-party liability in terms of insurance premiums, or responsibility to other stakeholders or customers. They may be concerned with financial loss within the organization, that may result in either an outage or some sort of breach that may occur if vulnerabilities are exploited. Or they may be responsible overall with, being concerned with reputational harm that may result in, a further scrutiny in the event that, that due diligence wasn't carried out properly. So some of the better ways that we can help these stakeholders understand this is to provide those narrative examples. So to be able to demonstrate and break down into a little bit clearer language what this means in relation to those critical business functions that we've already identified. Where possible, if you have the ability to demonstrate a proof of concept, that can be very helpful. It's something, there's a lot of security researchers online, particularly with more popular vulnerabilities that present more visual understandings of what these vulnerabilities look like, to be able to demonstrate those challenges. Either this is not as bad as you think it is, or this is actually a lot worse than you think it might be. And if you're able to do that in the context of what that asset owner or that business leader is responsible for, you can help them understand, how much risk they need to place in that particular challenge. And as we're going to get to a little bit later, and it's something we've spoken about in previous episodes, having a clear understanding of how critical the asset or the process is that may be affected by the vulnerability you're talking about is really important for that conversation. So the other piece to this is how are you able to normalize your understanding of risk across the organization? And so in the findings of our most recent security study, which for those of you who haven't had the chance to check it out, I strongly encourage you to do so. So our 2020 findings, which were recently released, identified that organizations that have integrated their cybersecurity risk management strategy and their enterprise risk management strategy experience significantly lower cybersecurity attack rates. And so this certainly covers more aspects than vulnerability management alone, but being able to take a risk-based approach to vulnerability management and really address the challenges first that are most important to the business can really help inform that more proactive approach that your organization is going to take. And that really helps with the known cyber risk exposure that your organization faces. There's certainly things that you need to account for as they arrive, but vulnerability management can really help you set that baseline. It can also help you evaluate that risk appetite that your business has and ensures that the recommendations that we're providing and the remediation plans align with that, to get that buy-in from the leadership teams who actually are going to be the ones to greenlight us hardening their environments. So Simon, from your experience, what are a couple ways that organizations that have integrated these two risk management strategies, how do they operate differently than those that haven't?
So the question is, as I observe them, how do the companies look different? How do they behave differently?
Yeah, from the experiences that you've had working with organizations.
Yeah, so I think the more mature organizations where you have that integration of cyber risk and vulnerabilities with an enterprise risk management framework, you have more distributed ownership of risk. And for example, that might extend to things like budgeting. So how security considerations or security investments that are required are budgeted for look very different in organizations where there's integration of these two programs where there aren't. So you'll see budget coming from application owners, or in a lot of cases like program management will own security budget related to the program initiative. And an internal security team will be consulted in determining that budget and execution, but it's not deferred specifically to the security team. It's very much owned by a program manager.
One of the benefits that I see from that is if security was a consideration in that new process or service or initiative that the organization is taking, you're also able to be more proactive in the recommendations that you're making early and have a more comprehensive influence over the process, as opposed to it being the 11th hour. It has to pass security muster before whatever it is that organization is considering goes into practice. And on one hand, that's going to cause friction just in terms of the scramble for the security team to provide the recommendations. But on the other hand, you're just not going to be able to have the best approach if you're having to bolt something on at the end. So definitely agree that you're going to provide a more resilient outcome with security consulted earlier in the process.
Yeah, don't go it alone.
In terms of remediation and integration, so it's important to consider that vulnerability management, when done either effectively or ad hoc and ineffectively, it does require work not only from those of us in the security space, but also from those asset owners and stakeholders that we help support. These efforts can improve your organization's risk posture, but they do come at a cost. There is effort that these non-security teams need to expend to be able to harden these environments, particularly over time. And that not only includes the specific rolling out of patches or deprecation of outdated software, but it's also going to include all of the rigor that IT operations and others need to perform testing on patches as they roll out to make sure that they're not going to affect performance of those assets. Selection and prioritization of remediation efforts as part of a larger IT operations strategy. And then also the effort that's required for end user education and overall management of changes in that environment. And a lot of that labor does not fall to the security team. And so being cognizant of this when we're making recommendations, and also how we talk about integrating solutions that are going to improve that quality of life for our partner teams is an important consideration. So our objective as security professionals is to get the most visibility that we can over over the environment that we have. So that's going to include not only the visibility, but also remediation as best as possible to ensure, our assets are in the most secure state that we can make them, as long as they're going to continue to enable business to operate the way that it's supposed to. But I think we need to start thinking about how we can share the intelligence that we have with asset ownership teams that actually are responsible for the other half of this. So in IT operations cases, that may mean delivering reporting on the hardware and software inventory that we have to help validate the tools that they have access to. And that can be done in an ad hoc basis, and that also can be done through integration opportunities. For DevOps teams, it could mean embedding some degree of vulnerability management capabilities into that pipeline to be able to catch bugs earlier in the development process by identifying those insecure packages or flaws that may have been introduced in a dev test environment instead of once those applications have been put into production. As we talked about in the previous episode, at the end of the day, security vulnerabilities are just bugs. And if we're able to treat them that way in the application development process, with the appropriate level of severity attached to them, then we're going to help our development and operations teams to focus more of their time earlier on developing the features and functions that their end users really want to see, instead of squashing security bugs once things have already gone into production. And in OT environments, that may also mean new visibility over asset classes that they only had through purchase order records or in an Excel document, to be able to confirm the status of those assets safely, as well as their, where the organization expects them to be in terms of Purdue modeling, and also where they actually are, to be able to ensure that those assumptions are being validated, and that those OT teams have that visibility, not from a security perspective, but just ensuring they can continue to operate their own environment safely and securely. So that comprehensive visibility provides benefits to us, but it does give us opportunities to extend this intelligence to our partner teams and hopefully improve their own processes. So to most effectively adopt a vulnerability management program, we need to think not only about the concerns that we have and the types of data that we need to make decisions about, risk within the environment, but also how to normalize that data the way our partner teams need to see it. We talked about integrations in the previous episodes with tool sets, so ticketing systems for different organizational units. So your IT ops folks, your development teams, looking at CI/CD pipeline tools and seeing how we can best pass information into those processes, and also your asset and configuration management repositories. And as much as possible, if we can find opportunities to enrich the data sources that our partner teams are using, instead of forcing them to log into another portal, they're going to get access to what they need to make decisions earlier in the process and in a way that that they're used to seeing, and will likely garner some more support from those teams, because we're able to give back as part of that process. So certainly thinking about how to integrate vulnerability management into that enterprise risk management program can have some challenges, and those range from the political that we've talked about to technological. So Simon, from organizations that have started to work towards this process to elevate that conversation to an enterprise risk management program discussion, where do you see some of the roadblocks that organizations have faced here?
Yeah, no question. My vote would be for it. Relates back to some of the political elements that we touched on earlier on in this webinar. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's always technical issues. There's comprehensiveness of scanning. There's issues with the scanning itself, executing on credentialed scanning. I mean, there's all kinds of technical issues, but they're all very resolvable. Whereas if you kick off a program and you start getting a lot of vulnerability data, and you have no way to relate it back to, initiatives that are important for the business, and you didn't start by laying the groundwork of identifying how business risk, like cybersecurity risk, is kind of distributed within your organization, it's really hard because once you get that data, that vulnerability data, you're reacting. You're in reaction mode. You're escalating to system owners and application owners, and you get caught in the machine really, really quick. So it's always nice to have that luxury. I'm always somewhat envious of my clients who are just embarking now on implementing a vulnerability management program because they have not yet seen what they can't unsee, which gives them the clarity of mind to align their business stakeholders and understand what their roles will be in managing the program.
And honestly, I think for those who are first stepping into the space, there's never been a better time to get started the way that the tools and the integrations have progressed in the last couple of years. It's a lot different than it was 5-10 years ago, where a lot of these processes were a heck of a lot more manual. Let's talk about prioritization and optimization for a little bit. So in the previous episodes, we've talked in more detail about the benefits of enriching your security program with vulnerability intelligence. And so we covered a couple of those stakeholders here, but we definitely got into more details conceptually in the previous webinar. So if that's something that you want to dive deeper into, we spent a full episode covering that. But keeping in mind how we need to understand where we focus our time, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So as Simon mentioned, being able to work backwards from those critical business drivers is really important. And when we talked about threat modeling in a previous episode, once we understand what those critical business functions are, we also need to map back what an attacker would do to be able to access those crown jewels, whether it's a process, whether it's intellectual property, whether it is the data that you have about your own customers, whatever that is those critical drivers for your organization. Being able to think conceptually about what it is that inputs and outputs from those assets or processes really helps you to understand where the priorities are in terms of what are the critical things that you need to keep available and secure. And the other part of this is also understanding, where's going to be your biggest bang for buck, particularly when you get started. There may be actions that you can take that, if looking at them by themselves, they may not be the most significant drivers of risk to the business, but they may be ones that are easy to accomplish and can be done comprehensively. And being able to identify, where those opportunities are to move quickly and get quick wins is really important. And as we had talked about previously, identifying likelihood and impact is important. So this gets back a little bit to the discussion about, how to address some of the concerns that our C-suite have about a vulnerability. If there's been a lot of publicity about something and they're really concerned about, tackling that first instead of the prioritization that we've put together. And being able to both understand based on your own environmental conditions and also explain this back to those non-security professionals about how relevant this is to our own team is important. The example I like to use here is from a couple of years ago, the big publicity campaign that sparked up around Meltdown Inspector. So everybody, in the world needed to learn about what speculative execution was in a short period of time, and they had really cool icons about what Meltdown Inspector looked like, and they have their own website as if they're almost like they're their own security company. And frankly, for a lot of organizations, the specifics about what they needed to concern themselves with were pretty limited. There were definitely organizations where that needed to be a huge focus of attention, but it wasn't across the board. And being able to break down what that looks like and share that information in more common terms can really help allay those concerns that your leadership has, or in the event that something looks less concerning than it actually is, being able to demonstrate the particular ways that it's going to impact not only that particular stakeholder's realm, but also the organization more generally. And if we're able to align with those enterprise risk objectives, we could demonstrate not only why we have to focus on the priorities that we're suggesting, but also how they're going to improve that risk posture. And that's honestly one of the ways that modern vulnerability management tools are really coming to the assistance of teams, is really helping to be able to demonstrate what the outcome is of those remediation activities, which I think is really valuable. And critical to successful integrations with some of these partner tool sets is understanding what the benefits and what some of the challenges or roadblocks may be for both parties, to get a really clear understanding of what the change is going to be if you're going to start going down that integration path. So a couple examples here. So if you're looking at integrating with your IT operations team for remediation activities, taking the effort to understand what that manual workflow looks like today to assign and validate remediation activities. Probably the case, you run your quarterly scan, you come up with a report and identify based on severity and provide that list to your IT operations team. And then they're going to validate with their own internal systems and go from there. So if you're going to turn that into an integration between the two efforts, what does that look like as a difference with your ticketing system? How is that going to affect the way that your configuration management database works? And on one hand, what are the benefits to that tighter integration in terms of closer communication, in terms of normalization of data and all those wonderful things? But also, what are the trade-offs that come from that? What are the challenges that both teams are going to need to face to make that happen, so that you can make a proper business case evaluation? On a similar note, if you're going to leverage vulnerability management intelligence in an incident handling capability, it's important to understand how those incident handlers in your organization are going to leverage vulnerability management intelligence. So what do they use today to be able to do that? And what steps in their review process would that come into effect? And what sort of information do they need? How do they need it? And how do they expect it to be delivered? If we can better understand this information, then we can help to provide them the information that they need when they need it. And so in terms of the integrations that we've seen, Simon, that have been most effective for organizations, particularly when they're getting started, or they have an existing mature process that they're trying to integrate with, where do you think the most value and most practical integrations are for organizations to leverage this info?
That's a tough question. So like most practical or have most value. So I would say like the most practical is really boring, but I would definitely recommend it, which is when you are doing credentialed scans, you want to ensure that the credential being used by Tenable is managed and properly managed and properly rotated. So you can integrate into your privilege access management system, and Tenable supports Beyond Trust and CyberArk out of the box to do this. And it's really important. It's a really boring thing, and I almost feel bad mentioning it because it doesn't increase your visibility in your environment. It doesn't make the output of your vulnerability management tool set any better. But it resolves an inherent vulnerability that comes with any agent-based infrastructure you deploy. So here we're picking on vulnerability scanners, but it could be, we've seen SIM agents compromise the credentials, or the token used by SIM agents compromised as well. So any kind of agent-based infrastructure, you want to be managing those service accounts used for credentialed anything out of a privilege access management system. So that's practical and a bit boring. I think what's maybe a lot more interesting and helps with overall security effectiveness is integrating to an ITSM, and with that comes the CMDB. So using Tenable for additional asset visibility, but way more importantly, adding context on asset vulnerabilities to the ITSM. So it ensures that essentially that every vulnerability that requires action has a home. You can automate a lot of workflows, and kind of extending beyond ITSM. A lot of SIMs themselves, even though they don't have a full CMDB, you can very easily use Tenable to enrich asset information if you're doing an investigation in SIM, and you want to know context about a specific asset. Tenable can integrate that in an automated fashion. So those types of integrations are more interesting and kind of feel like you're moving forward. But if I had to recommend you go out and do one thing, I would recommend that when you're doing credential scans, just make sure you're not using a static service account.
And just to touch on those two examples, I think they're really good ones. And to get back to that, what's in it for me conversation. And I think in both cases, there's definitely a mutual benefit to the security team potentially. So in the privileged access management case, I know this is true with Beyond Trust, but I know this is also an availability with the other privileged access management solutions, is providing that information contextually when those services are determining privilege to provide to a user or a service, and that information is going to come from your Tenable service. So there's definitely opportunities for both ends of that process to be both enriched and hardened that way. And on the IT operations integrations with the ITSM, the other important part for the security team, the what's in it for me part here, on top of making your IT operations people happier with you than they would otherwise be, is being able to, as part of that automated workflow, kick off scans to validate remediation. One of the things that's a big challenge with ITSM tools is they may not have comprehensive visibility into all the requirements for remediation. So great example with SCCM in particular is, Microsoft is going to push down, their Patch Tuesday patches and identify, the packages that you're going to need to roll out to your endpoints. But in many cases, they don't always capture all the requirements to remediate the vulnerability. There may be a registry key that needs to be set. There may be some other process that's not inherently visible in that IT operations tool set, and being able to validate that with the security team and also provide what that output should look like to the IT team helps close that loop.
Yeah, I'd say point of emphasis, Mitch. Don't create a separate workflow, right, for resolution of vulnerabilities. They belong in one place. It'll be a team effort within IT, and so ITSM integration makes all the more sense to manage that workflow.
Totally agree. And honestly, some of the larger breaches that we talked about in the first episode, that was one of the remediation practices that those organizations took up. I know, particularly with Target, I had the opportunity to hear the Target team talk about rebuilding after their big breach. And one of the most important considerations for them was that integration with ITSM to make sure that workflow was as automated as possible, and it was a shared practice between the security team and your IT operations folks. So covering the issues that we've addressed over these couple of episodes, I wanted to try and boil this down as best I can in terms of the things to consider when you're starting and also when you're reviewing the vulnerability management program that you have today. And that starts with understanding what your attack surfaces look like. So that may be as simple as your external and internal network surface. That may also include some of those other capabilities that we've talked about. So if you have a development team, their own environment and their processes, if you have an IoT assets, ensuring that you have visibility there. And also if you're looking at other issues, so speaking to cloud implementations or OT operations spaces, ensuring that you have visibility to what those looks like. It's something that I'm sure Simon can attest to, but when we do get calls from organizations who have been breached, one of the common ways that happens is there's an insecure service that was exposed and the organization either wasn't visible to it or hadn't taken the appropriate precautions to make sure it was locked down properly. And if you have that understanding of what those attack surfaces look like, then you understand the risk that's there and you can make the appropriate hardening decisions to do that. That can also help from the get-go to identify what your phased remediation plan is going to look like. As Simon mentioned, when you're first going to get started, there's going to be a lot of information that you're going to get. And being able to build that into a phased effort, because it is going to be work to be able to to get to a baseline from start, and having that comprehensive visibility of what's the asset classes that we're responsible for can really help with that. And I think it's also important to start as early as possible, to start documenting your compensating controls that may not be visible immediately in your vulnerability management tools, and what those risk acceptance points are. So there may be reasons to the business why you're not going to remediate something, or you have some other control in place that is going to protect that asset or process. And having that visibility early and establishing a process to be able to work with those teams to not only document them, but periodically review them is going to save you headaches down the road. And mapping those business critical assets and processes is really important to be able to align those priorities with your business leadership and asset owners. Helps you understand those organizational level risk thresholds, and also where they're going to be different, where there's specific environmental requirements that we have to treat things differently. And having those conversations early and often with those teams ensures that you're able to provide them the visibility that they need, and they're going to trust you because you understand what it is that they need to be able to do their jobs, and how you can best support them. And I think finally, reminding ourselves that vulnerability management is one of the most effective controls that we have to protect organizations from security attacks, but it does require work not only for us, but for the asset teams that we're responsible for, and for the leadership teams who need to make those risk prioritization decisions. And being able to understand those priorities allows us to provide recommendations that are going to align with that. And I think it's an opportunity early to ask what we can do to help as we're starting to embark on this effort, as well as understanding, once we have that visibility, what insights that this program can share with those teams to help enrich their own workflows for those stakeholders that we serve. That's it for the content for this webinar. I did want to share some additional resources for you to take a look at following this webinar. So I want to start with our 2020 security study. Touched on it briefly earlier. One of the most interesting things I think about this security study is we're focused exclusively on the Canadian security landscape, which is different than many of the other analyses that you're going to see about security markets. And it covers a wide array of topics that are really relevant to organizations. One that we didn't talk about today, but I think we covered on one of the earlier episodes, is we're now 2 years running where every single one of the customers that we spoke to has experienced security attacks, cybersecurity incidents. Not necessarily to the point of a breach, but it is, we've now realized that this is the new normal for organizations that hadn't experienced that yet. That's no longer the case. And as a result, vulnerability management is even more important today than it was before, to ensure that you can get that attacker's visibility and start to remediate, the areas that are going to protect those critical business systems. Also want to take the time now to mention that myself as CDW Canada's Tenable Guardian, or my team on our security solution architecture practice, are here to help you with this journey. So if there's questions that you have from this that are going to relate to your own internal business processes, or you want to better understand how you can take things to the next step, please work with your account teams and book time with us so that we can have these conversations with you. Also want to point out some of the resources that the Tenable team has. So they've been producing some fantastic webinar content as of late. There's a couple here in particular that I think are particularly helpful when you're getting started, or when you're looking at some of these new surfaces to be responsible for. And there were a couple questions that came up related to how we need to address security differently with the work from home requirements that many organizations are facing. Tenable has a couple of blog posts on this that I think are really relevant here. Make sure that we'll address this in the question and answer period, but if you want to look further into it, these two blog posts are quite good on that topic. And then finally, just want to reiterate, what we at CDW can do to help. So we have a vulnerability management as a service practice. So something that if you need additional assistance with your program, then we can help manage that on your behalf. Or to help you from a risk management perspective, align your vulnerability management practice with your enterprise risk management program. And we also have a terrific professional services team who can help with some of those integrations that we talked about. So whether it's with your ITSM, your SIM tools, your firewall infrastructure, or some of those other capabilities, certainly something that we can help you to help enrich that information you're going to leverage in other parts of your organization. So finally, I just want to say thanks again to Tenable for helping to sponsor this series and being our partners in this space.
Sure. Mitch, would this be a good time to review some of the questions we've received
so.
prior? Great. So I think you covered some of these off already, so just let me know if you have. We did have a question asking to compare Tenable.io with Tenable.sc, I think referring to Security Center. You feel like you've addressed that?
No, I will. So there's, I think, 2 or 3 questions that are talking about that and then the Tenable platform more specifically. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to cover those, but let's get through the specific questions first, and then we'll spend some time there.
Sure thing. So we have received a question. Please name the top 3 most common vulnerabilities for companies.
Okay. This is a bit of a tricky question. It's going to be very dependent on what your environment looks like, but I will mention that the US CERT, so that's us-cert.org, or if you Google US CERT, you'll find it. They publish annually most exploited vulnerabilities list, and some of these are perennial favorites, and some of them have changed in the last year with the increasing challenge requirements for work from home. So the ones that, and it's not necessarily a specific vulnerability, but they're more, classes and targets of vulnerabilities. And the ones that are most commonly targeted, not only in Canada, but around the world, are ones that are related to Microsoft's object linking and embedding technology. You can think of this as the macros and embedding capabilities that are going to be in your Microsoft Office suite. So whether you're adding a link to a document, or whether you're embedding an object into an Excel spreadsheet or a macro, those are often leveraged in phishing attacks to be able to escalate privilege in an environment. And phishing continuing to be that one of those significant challenges that organizations are facing, it's certainly an important attack vector to keep in mind, both in terms of patching the vulnerabilities themselves, but also the security awareness your organization needs to have about, talking to your employees about opening Excel documents that look suspicious, or enabling macros when something doesn't necessarily need to be the case. The second one on this list is related to Apache threats. So that was the vulnerability that Equifax got hammered with, but they're certainly not the only one to face this. And it is a very common problem because it frankly is, it's a technology that a lot of organizations need to leverage, and it's not tremendously easy to fix in production. So it's going to continue to be an issue for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. It's something that organizations need to address either directly through patching remediation or with compensating controls, but definitely an ongoing issue. And then the last one that's been a perennial favorite is Adobe Flash. I will say, and I think Simon can echo this as security professionals, if you don't need Flash as a corporation, don't have Flash on your computers, because it is a continually vulnerable program, and that's going to continue to be the case until we stop having to use it for things.
Yeah, there are options out there for isolated browsing. We have partners that sell. If you absolutely have to use Flash, and your accounts receivable, for example, needs to use Flash for some reason, that they do it in a completely isolated browsing session. So it's a very specific use case, but yeah, get rid of Flash if you can.
And then one of the newer focal points with threat actors right now is targeting VPN infrastructure. And it's for all the reasons that you'd expect to see with organizations increasingly having a distributed workforce, especially right now with work from home requirements. So in the last couple of months, we've seen some significant vulnerabilities related to, as an example, Citrix and Pulse Secure VPNs. And just speaking about remote access infrastructure more generally, it's increasingly a target of focus because threat actors understand that people are needing to work wherever they are. And those exposed services are one of the easiest ways to get into an organization. And if they're unpatched, they're going to be exploited.
Great, Mitch, you ready for the next question?
Yes.
I'm going to read it verbatim and then give you my interpretation. So the verbatim question was, Nessus scanning over IPsec VPNs to remote offices. And I think this is referring to using a Nessus scanner application and scanning a remote office that's connected through IPsec.
Right.
And I guess the question here is probably relates to feasibility or any guidance you might have for that
Right.
topology.
So it's definitely a challenge, and it's something that Tenable has addressed with their enterprise platforms by enabling not only the Nessus scanner itself, but some of the other types of scanning that you're going to have visibility to. And so this is an area where if you can do passive scanning through their network monitor or agent-based credentialed scanning on those assets themselves, you're going to save yourself the trouble of having to communicate indirectly through VPN. And part of the reason why this is a challenge is the way that the network or the Nessus scanner is designed is to speak to the TCP/IP stack as opposed to working through software-defined networks. And so that's going to lead to, if there's latency or timeouts, you're not necessarily going to get the full information as part of a scan, and that can lead to inconsistent results. And also, some of the modern security capabilities will also, prevent some of that scanning capability from happening. So some of the things that the Nessus scanner is going to do is use malformed packets to be able to identify different types of information. And Windows-based firewalls really don't like that and may end up dropping some of that traffic. So you're either going to not get a full list of hosts that you're looking for, or you may just get inconsistent results. So Tenable's guidance on this in particular is if you do have the ability to deploy Nessus in a VP or in as a virtual machine, and use your hypervisor to be able to funnel that traffic, then you're going to have effectively a virtualized version of that hardware tunnel, and that's going to be a lot more of a stable connection. But the next step even further is if you do have Tenable SE or Tenable IO deployed, being able to leverage some of those other scan techniques like agent-based scanning can help solve that problem as well.
All right, so to summarize your answer, Mitch, the recommendation is agent-based scanning, like you last mentioned, or using hypervisor to manage the backhaul.
That's right.
Okay, so we got 3 more questions, or maybe 2 more questions. The question, I'm going to read it verbatim again. Does the vulnerability management thought process change under current COVID circumstances, i.e. more people working remotely and less in the office? And I think you touched on this earlier, Mitch. Any other?
Yeah. So, and it's something that I would encourage you to check out that blog post that Tenable has presented, because one of the things that is increasingly a challenge for organizations isn't on the scanning side, it's on the remediation side. Particularly when you're talking about people on their own home networks, where the stability of a connection may not be the same as it is over a corporate network. When you're deploying patches or taking some of those more invasive efforts in terms of reconfiguration, there's concerns that could get corrupted or that process could break in the process, and it's a struggle that organizations are facing right now. But ensuring that you have visibility onto those assets that are outside of your corporate environment is incredibly important, particularly right now.
We have time maybe for one more question, Mitch, and I want to get this in because it was asked during the course of this presentation. And so the question was, how can Tenable IO integrate with ServiceNow or Palo Alto devices? What would be the features and benefits? So that's a 2-parter. Why don't we touched on ServiceNow already, but why don't we review ServiceNow and then secondly, Palo Alto?
Okay. So the primary way that Tenable is going to integrate with ServiceNow is with their ITSM functionality to integrate that workflow between the ticketing and automated processes that ServiceNow is delivering and the scan jobs that Tenable is going to run. But the other area that it also integrates with is in their vulnerability management and incident response capabilities. So piping that vulnerability management data back into those processes when the incident handlers are having to jump in and take a look at a particular event. And I believe on the Palo Alto side, it's more focused on providing that context around a particular incident and enriching the data that you're going to get as part of the Palo Alto stack. It depends a little bit on the technology that you're talking about, because Palo Alto has expanded beyond their traditional, firewall space, but there's definitely a number of integration points.
Maybe I can chime in there, Mitch. So I don't know if this is what because the respective portfolio is so broad, it's like, which integration do you want to talk about? But perhaps top of mind is Prisma Cloud, which is Palo Alto's platform for configuration review of public cloud environments. Tenable can act as a source of vulnerability information for Prisma Cloud, and that's an out-of-the-box integration. It's a few clicks within the Prisma Cloud interface to integrate your Tenable IO infrastructure and all the data that's within it. So it just, again, like we alluded to earlier with ITSM systems and also security infrastructure, it can leverage Tenable as a contextual enrichment for any given asset, in this case, in your public cloud environment. That would be the Palo Alto integration that's top of mind for me, anyways.
Mm-hmm. So I know we've hit the top of the hour and want to be cognizant of everybody's time and want to thank you all for spending the middle part of your day with us to talk about this. For those who are interested in hearing a little bit further about Tenable, I just want to touch briefly on the topics that we've covered today and in the previous episode, starting from how to prioritize vulnerabilities and the information and the drivers that focus on that. Is an increasing focus that Tenable has brought to bear. They have adopted a data science-driven approach to understanding vulnerabilities in your environment, focusing not only on the CVSS scoring that you're going to expect to see, but also that environmental context. So how likely is it that this vulnerability is going to get exploited in the wild? How is it actually being exploited in different types of events, whether it's malware campaigns, whether it's being used by targeted attackers, how mature the exploit code is in different sources, some of the dark web conversations that are happening about those assets. All that is being used to drive a dynamic score that's going to help you understand within your own environment what are the areas that you need to focus on. And that has helped elevate some things that CVSS has neglected, but it's also helped drive down the scoring on those vulnerabilities that may be critical in very specific circumstances, but for most organizations aren't, and can lead you to better prioritize your time on the vulnerabilities that you actually need to be concerned about. So they cover not only your traditional endpoint and server infrastructure, but they branched out into these other areas that we've talked about. So they have a dynamic application scanning technology called their web application scanner. They also have a container security integration that we touched on previously that'll integrate in line in your CI/CD pipeline. They have they actually just bought an OT company previously called Indige that provides active safe scanning for your OT infrastructure focused on your PLCs. They also have their Tenable Security Center, which is the on-premise version of Tenable IO. So one of the questions that came up was, what's the difference between SE and IO? And in many cases, the feature parity of the two platforms is quite close. They have different focal points. So SE is a lot more focused on really specific customization on reporting, where Tenable IO, being their cloud platform, is focused more on the integration feeds that they're going to get from those other sources. And one of the areas that they've recently introduced is a new layer that's going to sit over top of those two services called Lumen, which provides that enterprise level visibility and trending information over time, and aligns what they call VPR, which is that predictive prioritization metric, with asset criticality information that they discern from where that asset sits on your network, what's it running, what services is it using, who does it talk to, to be able to tell you, what that risk score is of that particular asset, and be able to identify that based on some of the tags that are important to you, whether it's different asset owners, whether it's location within the organization, whether it's the type of services that it's running and the sensitivity of the data concern, so that as an organization you can see not only overall how you're doing, but also drill down into those subsets and how to address them. So understanding we're definitely over the hour here. It's a topic that I'd love to talk further with you about if you're wanting to explore these platforms and understand what's the best approach for your business. Happy to book some time with you to address it.
Thanks, Mitch. I think we'll close it there. And Jason, you saw me. I thought we wouldn't get to that question in the time given, but feel free to reach out. It's the asset criticality rating is what I'm referring to in my answer in the Q&A, and you manually override that. So that's the short answer there. But thanks everyone for your time and sticking with us just past the hour here. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.